Currently, in the United States, Indigenous women are 2.5 times more likely to be victims of assault than any other group of women. A systematic pattern of recurrent and increasing violence has developed over many years. Ignorant government officials have deemed this issue insignificant, but in reality, the lack of protection of American Indian and Alaskan Native women by the federal government is inexcusable. A centuries-old issue, this matter has just recently gained more attention, yet legislation still needs to be passed to combat the issue. The Not Invisible Act of 2019 is a bill that has been proposed to the United States Congress. The bill would greatly improve the status and security for American Indian and Alaskan Native women, securing for them the rights and freedoms to which all citizens of the United States of America are guaranteed. Passage of this bill is critical, as anything less would perpetuate the historical and current mistreatment of Native women. The root cause of this problem lies in the foundation of America: colonization. Prior to colonization, women in tribes were considered sacred and powerful. They often had duties that were equally important to those of the men in their tribes. Then, the white male ideology of the colonizer was imposed on the Native people. The colonizer came with a philosophy of masculine superiority and feminine weakness. The colonizer viewed women as property. They introduced things like wedding rings, which signified patriarchal power and ownership. Some attempts in the past to address differences in the application of laws to Native people versus the general United States population have been made. However, the complexity associated with conflicting enforcement authorities and watered-down prior legislation have proven inadequate to the task of improving outcomes for female victims of violent crimes. Although the white male colonizer raped Native women to assert their dominance, Native men never used sexual violence against the white invaders, despite media-generated fears perpetrating myths about Native aggression towards white women. Before destroying the Icarus Nation, James Clinton, a Continental General, told his troops, "Bad as the savages are, they never violate the chastity of any woman their prisoner." The same respect for women has not been reciprocated by the colonizer to this day. In America, even in the 80s, a video game entitled Custer's Revenge was released. It depicted Custer raping an American Indian woman tied to a tree. Currently, 86% of the perpetrators of violence against American Indian and Alaskan Native women are non-Native. The fact that historically and currently non-Native men are responsible for the violations of rights of Native women makes clear the obligation all American citizens have to lobby for the Not Invisible Act of 2019. The disappearance of Native women is a significant issue. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, murder is the third leading cause of death for American Indian and Alaskan Native women. Moreover, Native women who live on certain tribal lands are murdered at a rate 10 times higher than the national average. The Urban Indian Health Institute collected data from law enforcement, missing person databases, news media, social media posts, and communication with Indigenous families, and compiled data from 71 cities. The data was requested for cases dating back to 1900, but very sparse records were available. Nonetheless, the Urban Indian Health Institute found 506 cases of missing and murdered American Indian and Native Alaskan women and girls in recent years. 25% were missing persons, 56% were murder cases, and 19% were unclassified. The unclassified cases were also called status unknown, and this was the result of insufficient evidence caused by the current complex relationship between federal, state, and tribal governments and their jurisdictions. The Urban Indian Health Institute identified that at least 153 cases of missing American Indian and Alaskan Native women could not be found in law enforcement records. Furthermore, of the 5,712 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls reported in 2016, only 116 were logged in the Department of Justice database. The lack of data is attributed to underreporting, race misclassification, lack of communication between law enforcement and Native communities, insufficient record-keeping patrol, racism in the media, and lack of communication between journalists and Native communities. As Anita Lucchesi, the head of the Sovereign Bodies Institute, explained, they'll, referring to law enforcement agencies, just do like white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and many of the cases that do get logged into systems are misclassified because the officer looked at someone and assumed or didn't enter the information in the system that defaults to white. The most prevalent cause of the lack of data in these cases is the relationship between the federal government, state governments, and tribal governments. American Indian tribes are considered a nation within a nation. Therefore, over the years, complicated treaties, laws, and regulations have been implemented to regulate their relationship with state and federal authorities in the United States. In instances of assault and violence towards Native women, the complexity of laws affecting the jurisdiction of each sector of government is problematic. Which government legally has jurisdiction over the issues involving missing and murdered Indigenous women depends on 3 factors: if the victim is a member of a tribe, if the accused is a member of a tribe, and if the offense took place on tribal land. In the event of violence, these regulations make victims subject to delayed and denied justice. The Not Invisible Act of 2019 was created to combat this issue, as it outlines the job of a new federal position. The Secretary of Interior shall designate an official who shall coordinate prevention efforts, grants, and programs across offices, take into account the unique challenges of combating crime, violence, and human trafficking, and report directly to the Secretary of Interior. The official described in the bill is crucial to the communication that is necessary between all government agencies, tribal, state, and federal, to combat this issue. Instances where the perpetrator is convicted are rare. Among the 96 cases that the Urban Indian Health Institute investigated, only 38 of the perpetrators were convicted, and 28% of these perpetrators were not found guilty. Among the Urban Indian Health Institute cases, approximately half of the perpetrators were not Native. The Urban Indian Health Institute was met with resistance while tracking this data, as the Department of Justice does not send 30 to 40% of cases to court. In 2016, only 35% of these cases were sent for prosecution. As expressed by the National Congress of American Indians, there is a lack of federal agency coordination, and there are regulations and laws that prevent tribal governments from equitable access to federal programs on par with state and local governments. The Not Invisible Act of 2019 works to combat the lack of federal programs and punishment for the accused. It not only creates a new official, but also an entire new committee focused on reducing violent crimes against Native people. This committee will include tribal law enforcement, state, and local law enforcement, and will make recommendations that impact the actions that are taken to combat violent crimes against Indians. Sarah Deer, an advocate for Native women who survived violence and a member of the Muskogee Nation, summarizes the complications involved with applying current legislation. I think that the federal Indian law has really worked as a patchwork of different laws that kind of almost contradict each other at times, which makes everything very confusing for all involved. And so sometimes when a crime is reported in Indian country, again depending on where you are, there is no action because everyone is in disagreement about who should be in charge, and nobody acts at all. The current legislation and systems that are in place lack a specific strategy for dealing with the problems of violent crimes in Indian country, and of Native American and Alaskan Natives. In 2010, the Tribal Law and Order Act was passed. This federal legislation mandated that federal authorities provide legal and investigative assistance to tribes. The Department of Justice, however, did not prioritize the legislation, and a report by the Inspector General found that the involvement of the FBI in serious crimes on reservations actually decreased since the bill was passed. Even though the Act of 2010 required more data collection on crimes committed on reservations, the data that was collected was outdated and was thereby deemed useless. The Not Invisible Act of 2019 has measures in place to ensure that data is not only collected, but action is taken in the event of violent crimes, as it focuses on committees and positions that will work to eliminate the barriers associated with complicated laws to ensure that federal and tribal governments can unite and administer justice. The first bill to be introduced by members of federally recognized tribes is the Not Invisible Act of 2019. 4 separate tribes joined together to promote the legislation. The bill was introduced to Congress on April 2nd of 2019, and on June 9th, the bill will be considered by the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. The bill is designed to unite tribal leaders and of federal officials to create legislation and communication that will combat the issue of missing, murdered, and trafficked Native people. The Not Invisible Act is crucial to combating this issue because people who are affected by the issue are the ones who need to be involved in fighting it. And that is exactly what this act does. The United States government cannot deal with this issue alone. As Echo Hawk, a member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, stated, "We've heard reports of families calling and saying their girls are missing, and the police saying, well, they probably ran away. There's an assumption that it's our fault, that we've gone missing or we've been murdered." Due to this type of assumptions and misunderstandings that have occurred, the voices of Native people are critical to improving this issue. Until now, the biggest obstacle faced by the Not Invisible Act of 2019 was not organized opposition, but rather apathy. The public has been simply unaware of the scale of the abuse. The lack of awareness of this issue in the United States is finally becoming apparent and has caused the unification of voices of Indigenous people to raise awareness for the issue. It is possible that the new attention to these issues is a consequence of the Me Too movement in the United States and the current climate whereby the nation's women have come to realize that they can be effective standing together against patriarchal systems of injustice. Passage of this act is by no means assured. The process of legislative approval is full of amendments, riders, and modifications, which individual representatives may tie to the legislation and ultimately render it impossible to secure sufficient support from a majority of elected representatives. But there is still hope. The first thing you or anyone can do to make change is spread awareness. Tell your siblings, parents, or friends who can vote. But to make a real difference, you can call your representatives to get the Not Invisible Act of 2019 passed.